بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. قال الله في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: وشروه بثمن بخس دراهم معدودة وكانوا فيه من الزاهدين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for tuning in to our third night of our commemoration of the Arba'in. And as you all know, yesterday, Thursday, was the day of Arba'in. And so tonight I'd like to spend a few minutes with you reflecting on the meaning of Arba'in. For those of you who tuned in today, during the Friday sermon, we went over some topics that were relevant to the message and movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And so I'd like to build a little bit upon those ideas and provide a little bit more perspective. So for those of you that are tuning in, I know there's an important Laker game going on now. I appreciate the fact that you are tuning in to listen to me share with you. But what I'd like to say is that in terms of the major contributions of the movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, I'd like to talk about one in particular, and that is that one of the major relevant contributions of the movement of Imam Hussein is the distinction between short-term thinking and long-term thinking. Having a short-term thought process versus a long-term mindset, a long-term thought process, a long-term vision and message. Being able to distinguish between those two ideas. And so if you look at it in terms of numbers, who won the battle, and we spoke about this a few weeks ago, Imam Hussein, in that specific battle, lost the battle, however he won the war. What does that mean? That if you were to look at that battle that took place with a short-term mindset, you would say that he and his companions and his family members lost. But if you were to look at the overall picture, then there's no doubt that the Imam was victorious. And as I mentioned earlier today, it's like looking at a picture, having one pixel versus looking at the entire picture. So relate that to short-term versus long-term thinking. Short-term thinking is like looking at one pixel. Long-term thinking, or having a long-term mindset, is like seeing the whole picture and understanding the entire picture. And this is relevant because there are many contemporary examples that reveal the tendency of human behavior to be inclined towards short-term thinking, short-term gains, rather than long-term thinking and long-term gains. I'll give you an example. If you look at the issue of protecting our environment, our ecosystem, if you take the example of global warming, many of us, we would rather be convenient in our lifestyle and not change anything, knowing that our habits, our lifestyle habits, are detrimental to society. Now, there's a growing movement now that that basically glamorizes sustainability and environmental responsibility. And it's interesting how these things only become relevant when they become popular on the news and in social media, when it becomes the cool thing to do. And so many people, they follow the path, not necessarily, even if it's the right thing, but so many people follow it not necessarily because it's the right thing, but because it's the glamorous thing to do, even if it happens to be the right thing. So being able to distinguish between doing the right thing and doing that which is popular and glamorous is an important distinction that we need to make. But this helps us understand the difference between short-term thinking and long-term thinking, in that we who are living today, we might not feel the most detrimental effects of global warming. We are to some extent. For those of you who are tuning in from Southern California, we're in October, and even though the past couple of days the weather has been somewhat pleasant, well, there's bad news. Next week it's going to get hot again in the middle of October. Temperatures are rising all across the world, and we're seeing the detrimental effects, but we're not experiencing the most detrimental effects. You know who will? The generation after us, our children, our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren. So many people are now becoming conscientious towards long-term thinking. It's not just about whether the world is going to be safe during my lifetime. What about my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren? And so another way to word this, or another type of language that we can use, is finite mindedness versus infinite mindedness. What does that mean? When we approach something with a finite mindset or a finite vision or finite thought process, we're thinking about what pleasures, for instance, just as an example, what pleasures we can get out of something, or what gains we can get out of something in the moment. If a person wants to get married to fulfill certain finite things in their life, such as desire, right? Such as physical desire. That's something. That desire is something which is finite. Once you attain it, you don't want it anymore. It's like hunger. Once you're full, you're not hungry anymore. Versus thinking about that relationship and thriving in that relationship with a long-term mindset, meaning thinking of it as something which becomes generational, right? What do I need to do in order to make sure that this relationship thrives in the long term? So this has many implications. I'll give you an example. Something that might make sense is the example of capitalism. Now you might be asking, well, what does capitalism have anything to do with finite mindedness or infinite mindedness, short term versus long term? I'll give you an example. In the United States, capitalism is seen as being an important component of the establishment of the bedrock of American society. The fact that those founding fathers believed in a free market system and constructed the American economy around a free market system. Now, capitalism has also been the target of many criticisms. Many of those are legitimate criticisms. But it's important to note that it's not so much the vehicle or the method itself, meaning capitalism, but how we approach capitalism which makes a difference. I'll give you an example. Between finite-minded capitalism and infinite-minded capitalism, between short-term thinking and long-term thinking within the same system of capitalism. When we talk about capitalism, one of the early thinkers that spoke about capitalism was a man by the name of Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith was an 18th century Scottish philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. So his ideas in The Wealth of Nations basically laid down the fundamentals of capitalism. And this is what he said. He said that, and this is basically rephrasing what he said, that the company's interests should always be secondary to the interests of the consumer. So when you establish a company within the capitalist system, what he's saying is that the purpose of that company should be that the interests of the consumer are primary to the interests of the owners and the shareholders of that company. Meaning that we have to listen to what the consumer wants. We have to listen to people. We have to serve. Our purpose as a company has to be the betterment of people, not the betterment of our wallets, not the betterment of our statements, not the betterment of our own pockets, right? And so for the longest time, that was the standard for capitalism. It was more of a long-term vision, that what can we do to make sure that we are benefiting the consumer? What can we do to make sure that we are benefiting society? And that was the norm for many, many years, until a man by the name of Milton Friedman showed up. And Milton Friedman, his ideas became popular in the 1970s and 1980s, and he was a Nobel Prize winning economist. He said it completely differently. This is what Milton Friedman says. He says, there is one and only one social responsibility of business. Get this. There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. So it's not so much about the consumer anymore. It's about who? It's about the owners. It's about the shareholders. There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. So whatever you do, you can do whatever you want legally, as long as you are increasing the profits of the business. And so when you look at companies and the way they lay off people by the thousands, this was virtually non-existent before Milton Friedman popularized these ideas. Why? Because sometimes, you see companies these days and throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s, when they want a better, when they want their statement to look better in front of the shareholders, when they want to show that they're profitable, what's the easiest thing for them to do? Is to cut jobs, layoffs, sometimes in the thousands, sometimes in the tens of thousands. And so this is short-term thinking. This is finite-mindedness. This is what can we do as a business, as a company, to make our statements look better for the next year or the year after that, so that we attract more investors, so that we can put more money into the pockets of the CEOs and the owners and shareholders. So it's the same system, but it's approached one way. One mindset or one thought process is long term, and the other is short term. And so, my friends, everything that we look at in our lives, we need to look at with a long-term mindset rather than a short-term mindset. And as I said, the message of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, his family, his companions, they lived a life so that we can stand on the shoulders of giants, that we can progress further, that we can take their understanding and progress further. When you think about standing on the shoulders of giants, there's a story that comes to mind, that it says that there was a bridge crossing over water, and a group of ants were crossing over that bridge. And so as they were crossing over that bridge, a group of elephants happened to also cross that bridge, and so it began to shake and it began to rumble. So once it began to shake and rumble, the ants, being too small to see the elephants, looked at one another, and they thought they were the cause of that shaking and rumbling. And they looked to one another and they said, we really did a good job here, didn't we? And so for us, looking back, it's like we are the ants and we have the elephants that came behind us in history, right? That are shaking and rumbling the bridge, and we're taking credit for it. So how does finite-mindedness pan out when we look at history? So if you look at the history of the city of Kufa, and let's take an example that's relevant to the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. If you look at the city of Kufa, what happened with Kufa in terms of leadership? You find that the leaders who were there before and after Imam Hussein also had short-sightedness. They approached their leadership positions with a finite mindset. What does that mean? So, in the story of Ashura, we know that Nu'man ibn Bashir, who was the governor of Kufa, is there and sort of takes a passive role. So Yazid ibn Muawiyah appoints Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, who at that time was the governor of Basra, to take over the operations of Kufa. So he does that. He perpetrates the battle against Imam Hussein, the assault. He does the evil deed, but he doesn't really last for long. Within a couple of years, Al-Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubaid al-Thaqafi comes in. He takes over Kufa. And when he takes over Kufa, his rule lasts for about 18 months until Mus'ab ibn Zubayr, the brother of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who was the leader in Mecca, defeats Al-Mukhtar and he becomes the ruler of Kufa. But that doesn't last very long either, because Mus'ab ibn Zubayr, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the sons of Zubayr basically, were at war with Banu Umayyah. And so Abdul Malik ibn Marwan finally takes over Kufa, and then he appoints Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi. It's one leader after another. And the reason I bring that story is because some of those leaders, they came in with the intention of not necessarily doing the right thing, but rather securing control and leadership for themselves. Approaching leadership with a very finite mindset. And when you do that, it never lasts because it's not built upon principles. So, why are people finite-minded? Let's ask that question. One reason is because most of us, we have a very, and I mentioned this today, most of us have a very transactional mindset. What does that mean? That means that whatever we put into something, we expect a return to happen right away. When we sow, we plant a seed and we want a tree to pop out the next day or the next week. We're not willing to wait months. We're not willing to wait years for those seeds to germinate and flourish and produce a substantial fruit for us. And so most people become very finite-minded. And the reason I talk about this is because when we read Ziyarat Ashura, there's a particular statement that shows up in Ziyarat Ashura that I'd like to share with you. And it describes the people that aligned themselves against Imam Hussein alayhi salam and why they did it. First of all, it describes Imam Hussein alayhi salam. It says, وَبَذَلَ مُهْجَتَهُ فِيكَ لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ عِبَادَكَ مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ وَحَيْرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ. Such a powerful description. That he gave, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he gave the blood of his heart. Not just any blood. He gave the blood of his heart. لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ, for the purpose of saving or salvaging, لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ عِبَادَكَ مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ وَحَيْرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ, to salvage and save people from ignorance and from despair and being led astray. Meaning that he was so passionate about relieving people from ignorance that he was willing to give up the thing that was most dear to him, which was the blood of his heart. See, we can either be transactional or we can be transformational. Transactional is when you do something so you get something in return. Transformational is when you do something so that you become a better person, not necessarily to get something in return. Imam Hussein was not being transactional here. He was being transformational. He wanted to transform society. But what was he willing to give up? He was willing to give up the blood of his heart. وَبَذَلَ مُهْجَتَهُ فِيكَ لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ عِبَادَكَ مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ وَحَيْرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ. And then, this part of Ziyarat al-Arba'in describes the people who aligned themselves against the Imam. It says, وَقَدْ تَوَازَرَ عَلَيْهِ مَنْ غَرَّتْهُ الدُّنْيَا. Those people that aligned themselves against him are the ones that fell prey and were tricked by this dunya. the appeal of the glittery things in this world. وَبَاءَ حَظَّهُ بِالْأَرْضِ الْأَدْنَى. And he took what he had, this person, and he sold it for the most lowly thing, for the most non-valued thing. وَشَرَى آخِرَتَهُ بِالثَّمَنِ الْأَوْكَسِ. And he sold his afterlife, his akhirah, very cheaply. He sold himself cheap. He sold himself short. Because of something that he thought he was going to attain in this world. Whether it was a rank, we know Umar ibn Sa'ad was promised to be the governor of one of the newly established Islamic provinces in present-day Iran. Or whether it was a regular soldier who was just on the payroll. And by the way, when Al-Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubayd al-Thaqafi, when he rose up against the Umayyads, and when he rose up against the army of Umar ibn Sa'd and Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, one of the ways that he was able to track down the soldiers was because he had access to the payroll once he took over in Kufa. So he knew exactly who was on the payroll, and he was able to track them down and seek vengeance. So people stood against the Imam, knowing that the Imam was on the path of truth. But what the dunya had to offer them was more appealing. That's having a short-term vision or a short-term mindset versus those who chose to have a long-term vision, long-term mindset, such as the companions of the Imam, such as Al-Hurr ibn Yazid al-Riyahi. And here, and this is why I mentioned the verse in the beginning from Surah Yusuf that says, وَشَرَوْهُ بِثَمَنٍ بَخْسٍ دَرَاهِمَ مَعْدُودَ. The brothers of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, the brothers of Prophet Yusuf tossed him in the well. When he was retrieved from the well, the people who retrieved him from the well sold him to a caravan of travelers for a very cheap price. They had no idea who this boy was or who this boy would eventually become. And so they sold him for a very cheap price. And sometimes we sell ourselves for very cheap. And the way that we do that is by having a short-term vision rather than adopting a long-term vision and a long-term mindset. You know, a lot of the times when we sell ourselves for cheap, it's because we don't know the value of who we are. There was a famous investor one day, he said that everybody knows the cost of something, but nobody really knows the value of anything. If you ask someone to, and I've seen this where people will spend $50, $100, $200, $500 on a weekend of entertainment, but they won't spend a fraction of that amount on a self-development book or a self-development seminar. That entertainment, that short-term entertainment which disappears and has no value after it's gone, is more appealing to them than something that can potentially change the way that they think, can have an effect on their mindset and their family legacy for generations. And so we know the cost of things, but we don't really know the value of anything. So do we know our value? Do we know the value of, when we talk about the movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, do we really know the value that it added to the Islamic world and to humanity? So when we know ourselves, when we know what we're made of, when we know to whom we belong, we stop selling ourselves for cheap. There's a narration that I want to share with you. It's from Nahj al-Balagha. And it's attributed to Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he says, الدنيا دار ممر ولا الدنيا دار ممر لا دار مقر. This dunya, it's like passing through a hallway. Literally, he says, it's a hallway. it's not a destination. If you check into a hotel, think about how strange it would be before you got to your room. You walk in the hallway, you take the elevator, you're walking in the hallway, and all of a sudden you say, you know what, this looks pretty here. I think I'm going to settle here, instead of going to the room. Think about that. So people who go after dunya, they're settling in the hallway rather than actually going to their suite, which is the akhirah. The suite is the akhirah. And so on the commentary of this hadith, it says that one day a man asked a group of people, he said, who is the most foolish of people? And so they answered, the one who is most foolish is the one who sells his akhirah for his dunya. He sells the afterlife for this world. Meaning he sells himself short, he sells himself cheap. And so he replied to them, he said, and the one that is more foolish than that is the one who sells his akhirah, his afterlife, for somebody else's dunya, for somebody else's pleasures, worldly pleasures. And you see that sometimes. Sometimes people sell themselves. And they sell themselves for what? There's no benefit. There's no true enjoyment to them. Just like how you see fanatics and cult followers, how they'll worship someone, and this happens a lot during elections across the entire world, where people will sell their soul for someone, and there's no true benefit to them. They've sold their afterlife, they've sold everything, and there's no true benefit to them. And so we seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from that type of behavior. To end, I just want to share one hadith from you, and this is from Al-Imam Al-Askari alayhi salam, the 11th Imam, and he describes 5 signs of a believer. He says, Alamatul mu'min khams. There are 5 signs of a believer. Number 1 is Salat ihda wa khamseen, which means offering 51 units of prayer. And so what that basically boils down to is the 17 obligatory units of prayer that are offered within the 5 daily prayers, plus the 34 extra prayers that are prayed. So 34 plus 17, right? It's 51, right? Got that correct. That's the first sign. The second sign is ziyaratul arba'in, and this is why I mentioned the hadith. Another sign of the believer is ziyaratul arba'in, the paying homage and paying and giving our salutations, paying our respects, and visiting Imam Hussein alayhi salam on the day of arba'in. وَالتَّخَتُّمْ بِالْيَمِينِ. So this is at-takhattum bil-yamin, wearing a ring on the right hand, specifically the right ring finger. This is the sign of a believer. This one's not mine, it's my father's, but here just to show you an example. وَالتَّخَتُّمْ بِالْيَمِينِ وَتَعْفِيرُ الْجَبِينِ. Ta'fir al-jabin literally means to place dirt on the forehead. And what that refers to is that when we prostrate on dirt. That's why when we, as the followers of Ahlul Bayt, when we prostrate in our prayers, we don't prostrate on regular carpet. We prostrate on dirt or a piece of dirt. وَالْجَهْرُ بِبِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. That in prayers, when we say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we say it out loudly. And that's a difference you'll find between the Shia and other schools of thought, is that in prayer we proclaim Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. But one of those signs is Ziyaratul Arba'in. And as I mentioned today, so many people had the intention of traveling, but were not fortunate enough to do so because of all of the travel restrictions. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to count us among those who receive the rewards of the pilgrims. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the opportunity as it arises in the coming years to physically be there in Karbala and to perform the ziyarah, to pay our salutations to the Imam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our deeds in these months as we come to a close in the month of Safar. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.